All right, so here's the deal. There were a series of upsets. Shinya Aoki was upset. Gary Tonin got back to work. He was not upset. I think he finished his opponent in about 55 seconds, something very, very quick. Other fighters of note, Giorgio Petrosian, I believe, lost in a split decision to a Thai fighter. But the big one that really caught everybody's attention, in addition, by the way, to Shinya Aoki losing, is Sage Northcutt. Sage Northcutt got viciously KO'd in the first round by Cosmo Alexandre. Alexander is kind of how it's spelled. And I know a lot of folks are shocked by this. This is like, okay, so let me tell you about this knockout. It was a right hand that puts him down. I think he may have thrown a hammer fist after the fact, but it was basically a one-hitter quitter. He fell face forward, Sage Northcutt did. Oftentimes in MMA, when you watch a knockout, you actually get a better appreciation for it in slow motion. This one is almost the opposite, where you don't really appreciate it in slow motion because it looks like a hard shot. But Alexandre sets it up by throwing a right hand, essentially to a Northcutt who was fading into his right. Caught him on the half beat, and he had his hands down, no head movement. He just timed a well-placed, hard, fast punch about as good as you can given the circumstances, right? And it put him down. We actually have the call for it, do we not, Jael?
We do.
Let's hear it.
People that want to grapple with him. Cosmo!
Cosmo Alexandre throws the one-hitter quitter, Michael Cervello.
Yeah, that's the call. Play it one more time, and here's what I want you to pay attention to. From the moment that they go, ooh, which means the punch landed, listen to how fast the ding-ding-ding of the bell happens. Listen to how closely those two are connected. Play it one more time.
People that want to grapple with him. Cosmo!
All right, you get the idea. This was a hard punch, man. And Sage Northcutt, as I mentioned, face down. That is all she wrote. So now when you look at it, you think back to the big signings that one made in the Western world, so to speak. They had signed Eddie Alvarez from the UFC. They had signed Demetrious Johnson from the UFC in a trade for Ben Askren. And now, on top of that, they had signed for Sage Northcutt. And all three, you guys might recall, had done a big media tour where they had gone on every show, not this one, but they'd gone on a bunch of other shows, a bunch of other podcasts, done I think a workout in Las Vegas. At the same time, there was a UFC event. Just a gajillion things that they had done. And why wouldn't they? Right? Eddie Alvarez is a big signing. Demetrious Johnson is a big signing. And even Sage Northcutt, I still maintain, is a big signing. But of those three, they've gone 1-2. And the two losses were not close. They both got stopped quickly. So there's a lot of questions here about what's happening. Is this a function of bad luck? Is it a function of, well, maybe these one fighters are better than we thought? Is it a function of matchmaking? Look, how do we explain that you've got three big signings from the UFC, including, by the way, in the case of Alvarez, a former champion? You can say what you want about Northcutt, like about as a prospect, but Eddie Alvarez has one of the best resumes in the sport, and these guys are losing. And you could even say Demetrious Johnson got pushed, although that can be true of a lot of fights where he ultimately ended up winning. So I don't think that's that big a deal. But as a fan of MMA, how do you explain how these UFC vets have gone 1-2-1? I would actually say that there's a pretty straightforward reason for some of these kinds of things. Here is, to me, the overarching lesson here. Okay, before I get to that, let me just say a couple things about Sage. Number one, he's still 23. I think folks should not lose sight of that. Now, that doesn't necessarily exonerate him all the way, but okay, the guy's 23. All right, so let's just be honest about that. Getting knocked out by Cosmo Alexandre, it's not great. certainly, and there could be some reasons for concern going forward, but you don't want to be too alarmist either. There's a big question here about where Sage wants to go in his career. As I mentioned on Twitter, two things. One, if you guys don't know who Cosmo Alexandre is, this is a decorated and experienced kickboxer. This is a guy who I think holds multiple wins over John Wayne Parr. He's not some average donk. And he's had a very, very minimal, limited run inside of MMA. He has the overwhelming majority of his combat sports career has taken place in the kickboxing circumstances. So you would have thought that Sage would have gone for a takedown relatively early. Not that that's the best part of his game, but that probably would have been his best options, all things being equal. And he didn't. And he paid for it. Alexandre hadn't competed since 2016 inside MMA, and before that 2014, and then before that 2012. He's 8-1 now inside of MMA competition. So one, there's just that issue. Okay, this was a guy who on the feet had a significant skill advantage. All right, and by the way, my producer tells me he has 3 wins over John Wayne Parr. I mean, that is I'm not here to present Alexandre as the best kickboxer of our generation. Far from it, but he's very good, very good. Number one. Number two, Cobb, you saw the video. Now, here's what I am reading on Twitter. Folks believe that there is a size advantage in favor of Alexandre. Historically, this is a guy who has competed in the 160s and 170s. Sage is a guy who has fought in the 170s and the 155s in MMA. So, from a track record standpoint, they have competed in similar weight classes. But I wonder what your eye test tells you about the size discrepancy, or perhaps you don't see one.
Alexandre does look bigger, but I don't know. It might just be the cost of Sage's muscle. I mean, he's. I don't think he's got an ounce of fat on him, so that might just be one of those things where he's heavier,
right?
Even though it doesn't look it.
Right. So here's the reality about this: because one offers no transparency in their weigh-in program, where people, I'm told from other managers, people will miss weight. They'll just create new catch weights for both of them, and no one knows who actually missed weight. In terms of the public, anyway. I hear that happens all the time. But whatever the case is, remember, I talked to Gary Tonin. I said, Gary, you ever seen your opponent's weigh in? Nope. And remember, this is the one where everyone apparently has solved the weight cutting problem. I'm not saying that's true. I'm not saying it's not true. Here's the point. There's literally no transparency in this weigh-in program. So could Alexandre be bigger? I don't know. I'm not here to tell you that about your lying eyes. I really don't have a comment about it, other than to say it's at least worth asking the question because we don't actually know how big he is. How big he is and how much he weighed in at. We really don't know. But to me, the bigger issue here, the one that really encapsulates this, the one that really gets this to the heart of the matter, rather, here is one thing that if you're a UFC critic, it has to drive you crazy. What I mean to say is, one of the things the UFC and their matchmakers have always been really, really good at is knowing when to move on from a guy. Now, you can say, well, Luke, how can that be in a week where we're talking about should BJ Penn retire, should Anderson Silva retire? That's different because I don't think the UFC is confused about their abilities. Right? That doesn't, to me, strike me as the issue. The issue is not that those guys are sitting there in their office being like, gee, why can't these guys win? That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is when guys are in certain positions in their careers and they want more from the organization, and the organization, they might be willing to re-sign them, but they kind of feel like they might be damaged goods, they're not going to make a real strong effort to do it. And those fighters might still have some names that they can go and take elsewhere. Now, sometimes that has backfired, right? After Dan Henderson beat Michael Bisping, they let him go to Strikeforce, and he had a bit of a rough run there in certain capacities. But he also had a great rebound, too. Now, he eventually came back to the fold. They don't get it right every time, but they get it right a lot, man. And I have seen it over and over and over and over again. You're like, wow, they let this guy go. Yeah, they usually have a sense about someone being damaged goods or just not worth any kind of price beyond the bare minimum they were willing to pay. They might have been perfectly willing to re-sign Sage or perfectly willing to re-sign Eddie just at a discount price relative to what those guys thought they were worth. And no one should be mad at Eddie, and no one should be mad at Sage for trying to maximize their value. But to me, I have seen this play out a number of times. The UFC has a real knack for this kind of talent identification, where guys are, what their worth is, how much we want to pay for them, let someone else go have them, and then there is this problem that emerges all the time. Not a perfect track record by any stretch, but a pretty decent one. They get that one right a lot. In the case of Eddie, he's just taken a lot of damage, and the guy he fought, people just didn't know how good he was. Credit, as I always say, to Grabaka Hitman on Twitter. This is a guy who knows so much about these sort of regional shows and international shows that don't get as much shine here in the United States. He knew that one was actually a pretty competitive bout. So that's surprising only relative to those who weren't up to date on exactly how good the opponent was. And in this case, too, as I mentioned, dude, Alexandre is a very good kickboxer. Here's the issue with Sage going forward. He is 23. Here is his record in MMA to date, right? So he's 11-3. He was on a 3-fight win streak. Okay? He debuted in 2015 in the UFC, beating Francisco Trevino, Cody Pfister, losing to Brian Barberena, which was that terrible... It was a terrible... they called it an arm triangle choke. There's a question about whether that actually is what it was. Then he beat Enrique Marin barely at UFC 200. Loses to Mickey Gall pretty handily. That's when he had the rebound against Michel Quinones. He beat Thibaut Gouti. Then the best win of his career, in my judgment, was against Zach Otto, which came in 2008 of July. So this was his return bout to the competitive space, again, albeit in a ring, at One Championship Enter the Dragon in Kelang, Singapore. He lost in 30 seconds, by the way. I was listening, Jael, you'll appreciate this. I was listening to Liquid Swords the other day, and I was listening to the Jizza talk about how he had the footwork, of Freddie Adu. And I was like, yeah, Jizza, that line didn't age too well. Here's the thing that sort of stands out to me. I'm not ready to proclaim where Sage's career goes from here. As I said over and over and over again, the guy is 23. Right, the guy is 23 years of age. I don't really know. I don't really know where it goes. Suffice to say, though, that they didn't do him a lot of favors in his early matchmaking here in one. Not that they should have. I'm not mad at him for it. I just want to be clear about that. They didn't give him a super favorable matchup. And if you want to argue, well, they did, and he just didn't wrestle, well, then you could make a claim about his fight IQ, or at least his strategy. So there's a claim there. But I also want to make this clear, too. While I am perfectly willing to say that I don't want to throw Sage under the bus, you also out there need to start looking at the evidence here and saying it's also not a foregone conclusion that he's going to turn this around either. This is very much a bad loss. I don't know if I want to say crossroads moment, because that doesn't seem right necessarily, but guys, he's got 14 MMA fights. He's got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 UFC fights. That's a fair amount of experience. That's not insignificant. So we need to see where he goes from here. We need to see what kind of skill sets he develops from here. We need to see how he wins or loses or what it looks like from here. And I'm not willing to close the book on him yet. But I'm also very much prepared mentally for reality where not everybody who was a hyped prospect turns out to be very good. Dude, I've said this before a million times. Talent identification is difficult. Talent grooming is difficult. Not everybody can do it very well. And even look at these sports organizations that have literally billions of, or at least they're worth billions, and they spend tens of millions of dollars on talent identification, talent recruitment, talent development. And they get it wrong all the time. Right? There was a debate for a while about Ryan Leaf and Peyton Manning. Because for a short window, it was somewhat debatable. You just didn't have enough information. And folks tried to make a feeling or a case for certain things. RG3 was the greatest thing ever in my hometown until he just wasn't. He just couldn't throw anything but goddamn screen passes and checkdowns. That's a different story for a different time, but inside boxing too. And I mentioned Freddie Adu. Not everybody works out. Some people peak early. Some people never peak. Some people peak very late. But you got to be ready. You have to be mentally ready for the reality that he can absolutely keep working on his skill set, take some more time, develop things, and perhaps put together a great run. On the other hand, it is in no way unfair to say 14 fights into his professional MMA career, the way in which he's losing to the guys in which he's losing to either show a lack of overall ability or a lack of ingenuity to use relative advantages. And this might be his ceiling. Could very well be. Could very well be. That's harsh. That's not fun to say. I don't derive pleasure in getting on this microphone and saying this to all of you. But what am I supposed to do? Lie? And say, oh, yeah, no, he's definitely going to be the next UFC or ONE champion. I'm not ready to write him off, but I am absolutely ready to pencil him in either list at this point. He's got to start figuring this out fast. In 6 fights, he'll have 20 overall professional MMA fights. You'll know for sure where he is by then. There'll be no doubt about it. He's either going to... These next 6 fights are critical. Critical. Cobb, am I... Just because I know everyone thinks I'm a world-class hater, am I being overly judgmental here? Frankly, if I'm being honest with you, I think I'm being too generous with the analysis here. My hunch is that this is probably all you're going to get, but in fairness, I don't know that, and I've been wrong about talent identification as well. Where do you come down on this?
No, I think you're right. I think you're honestly more fair than most with Sage, to be perfectly honest. We talked about it. There's the last couple of UFC fights, I felt like he was showing improvement. His striking, his decision-making, he was a bit more calculated. Yeah, sometimes you just run into a guy who's better than you. He's still, again, 23 years old. Got a lot to learn still. So, I mean, we'll see what happens. But he does need to start figuring out some things to get some wins under that belt.
Yeah, fast. And also, you fought a guy who hadn't fought in 3 years in MMA. Why are you striking with him? You know what I mean? And I get, granted, it's 30 seconds, but like these dudes don't need time. They look at the short little window this guy had, and you could say, oh well, he's so new to professional MMA, he didn't know. This was his 14th MMA fight, his 14th MMA fight, and then add on top of that all of the karate experience that he has, which I realize is very different, but still, competition experience is valuable in terms of mindset, preparation, getting in the zone, dialing in. It's a bad loss. It's a bad loss. So let's see what happens. Let's see where he goes. At 23, by the way, last thing I'd say about this, he has been dropped in 4 of his last fights. 4 of his last 5 fights, which is another worrying sign. So I want everyone to understand when a promoter is trying to sell you something, that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to sell you something. And sometimes it's the genuine article, and sometimes it's not. And it's hard to tell the difference. And you want to be fair to fighters. But the truth is just what the truth is. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel. There's other videos you can watch right here. If you've never heard my SiriusXM radio show, there's a link in the description box below. You can try it for free for 30 days. The Luke Thomas Show airs weekdays, 3 to 6 p.m. Eastern on SiriusXM Fight Nation, Channel 93. Catch y'all next time.